The champagne flutes clinked around the table at the Sterling Room as Derek leaned back in his custom Italian suit, that practiced smile playing across his lips while Gregory Chen asked me what I did for a living. My husband's hand found my knee under the table, squeezing just hard enough to remind me of my place before he answered for me. "She's just a housewife," he said with that dismissive laugh I'd grown to recognize over 7 years of marriage, as if those 3 words explained everything about who I was and wasn't. The table erupted in polite chuckles while I sat frozen with my dessert fork halfway to my mouth, watching the people I'd helped build financial portfolios for treat me like expensive wallpaper. What Derek didn't know as he ordered another bottle of Dom Pérignon on what he thought was his platinum card was that I had my phone in my lap, and with 3 taps and a biometric confirmation, I'd just frozen every single account he thought belonged to him. $12 million, locked tighter than a vault, and dessert hadn't even been cleared yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story actually begins 3 years earlier, in a different version of my life where I still believed that love meant partnership and marriage meant building something together instead of watching someone systematically erase you. I met Derek Lansing at a financial technology conference in Denver where I was presenting on algorithmic trading patterns and risk assessment models. My company, Cascade Financial Group, had sent me as their lead quantitative analyst, a position I'd earned through 6 years of 70-hour weeks and a graduate degree in applied mathematics that I'd completed while working full-time. Derek approached me after my presentation with intelligent questions about market volatility predictions and a smile that seemed genuinely interested in my answers rather than just trying to impress me with his own knowledge. Our courtship felt like finding someone who actually understood the language I spoke. He worked in commercial real estate development, a field adjacent enough to finance that our dinner conversations flowed easily between interest rates and market trends. When he proposed after 8 months of dating, overlooking the city from his penthouse in Cherry Hills, I said yes without hesitation. My parents had divorced when I was young, and I'd spent my childhood watching my mother struggle to rebuild her life after giving up her career for a marriage that didn't value her sacrifices. I'd promised myself I would never make that mistake, and Derek seemed like proof that I didn't have to choose between love and professional identity. The wedding was elegant and understated, exactly what we both wanted. My sister Diane flew in from Seattle with warnings I didn't want to hear about moving too fast and making sure I kept my financial independence. Claire Richmond, my closest friend from graduate school, echoed similar concerns over wine the night before the ceremony. She'd watched too many brilliant women disappear into marriages where their intelligence was treated as a hobby rather than an asset. I dismissed their worries with the confidence of someone who believed she'd figured out something they hadn't, someone who thought she was too smart to fall into obvious traps. The first year of marriage was everything I'd hoped for. We maintained separate accounts as I'd insisted, both contributing to household expenses proportionally based on our incomes. Derek seemed proud of my work, asking about my projects and celebrating when I successfully predicted a market correction that saved our clients millions. We hosted dinner parties where I could discuss complex financial instruments with his business associates, and he never once suggested I should simplify my explanations or dumb down my expertise. I thought I'd found the rare man who wasn't threatened by a woman who understood compound interest rates better than he understood his own investment portfolio. The shift began so gradually that I didn't recognize it as a pattern until much later. Derek started mentioning how stressed I seemed, how the long hours at Cascade were affecting my health and our relationship. He massaged my shoulders after particularly brutal weeks and suggested that maybe I didn't need to prove myself quite so hard anymore, that we were financially comfortable enough that I could afford to ease up. The suggestions felt caring at first, like genuine concern for my well-being rather than strategic manipulation designed to make me question my own priorities. When I was offered a promotion to senior vice president that would have included equity stakes and a seat on the executive committee, Derek's mask slipped for the first time. We were having dinner at home, and I'd excitedly shown him the offer letter with its impressive compensation package and expanded responsibilities. He set down his wine glass carefully and asked if I'd really thought this through, whether taking on more stress was worth whatever validation I was seeking. The word validation stung because it reframed my ambition as insecurity, my drive as something psychological rather than professional. We argued that night, the first real fight of our marriage. Derek accused me of prioritizing work over our relationship, of never being present even when I was home. He suggested that maybe we should think about starting a family soon, that my biological clock was ticking and this promotion would make that impossible for years. I was 32 years old with a career I'd spent a decade building, and suddenly I was being told to consider whether I wanted to be a senior vice president or a mother, as if those two identities couldn't possibly coexist in the same person. I turned down the promotion. The decision haunted me immediately, but Derek was so relieved and appreciative that I convinced myself I'd made the right choice for our marriage. He planned a celebration dinner at the Sterling Room, the same restaurant where everything would eventually collapse, and toasted to us finally putting our relationship first. Looking back, I can see that night as the moment I began erasing myself, choosing his comfort over my advancement and calling it compromise. The next suggestion came 6 months later. Derek's development company had hit a rough patch, several deals falling through due to economic uncertainty that my own analysis had predicted months earlier. He came home one evening looking defeated, talking about cash flow problems and investors getting nervous. Without thinking, I offered to look at his financial projections, to apply the same analytical models I used at Cascade to help identify where he could restructure. He accepted gratefully, and I spent weeks of evenings and weekends effectively working as his unpaid financial consultant. My analysis saved his company. I identified 3 projects that were bleeding capital with minimal return potential and restructured his debt obligations in ways that freed up operating cash while improving his balance sheet. Derek's investors were impressed enough to commit additional funding, and his company stabilized then grew. He credited my help in private but never mentioned my contributions to his business associates or investors. When I pointed this out, he explained that it would undermine his credibility if people knew his wife was doing his financial analysis, that commercial real estate was still an old boys' network where showing any weakness was dangerous. I accepted this explanation because I wanted to believe my husband wouldn't deliberately erase my contributions. I told myself that supporting your spouse's success was what marriage meant, that not everything needed public recognition. Claire saw through it immediately when I mentioned it over lunch. She asked me point blank if Derek had ever supported my career the way I was supporting his, if he'd ever made sacrifices for my advancement or spent his free time helping me succeed. I couldn't answer because the truth was uncomfortable. Our marriage had become entirely one-directional, with my expertise flowing toward his benefit while my own career stagnated. The pregnancy happened accidentally, or so I thought at the time. We'd been careful with birth control, but Derek had been unusually insistent about timing during what he claimed was my fertile window based on some app he'd been tracking. When the test came back positive, his joy seemed genuine enough that I pushed away my suspicions about the convenience of the timing. He immediately started talking about how this changed everything, how I'd need to take maternity leave and probably step back from the demanding schedule at Cascade. I lost the baby at 11 weeks. The miscarriage was physically painful but emotionally devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd been ambivalent about the pregnancy initially, worried about how it would affect my career, but losing it felt like losing a possibility I hadn't realized I wanted. Derek was supportive in the immediate aftermath, taking time off work to stay home with me, bringing me tea and holding me while I cried. Then, 2 weeks later, he suggested that maybe this was a sign we should try again soon, that I wasn't getting any younger and we shouldn't waste time grieving when we could be working toward having a family. His response felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It wasn't that he was being cruel, but rather that he'd somehow managed to reframe my grief as motivation for his preferred timeline. When I said I needed time to heal both physically and emotionally before thinking about another pregnancy, he agreed, but with visible disappointment that made me feel like I was failing at something I'd never agreed to prioritize. I threw myself back into work at Cascade with renewed intensity, partly to escape the sadness at home and partly to reclaim some sense of purpose beyond my failing reproductive system. My performance reviews remained excellent, and I was being considered for a different leadership position that would focus on developing new quantitative models for cryptocurrency markets. The field was exploding, and my mathematical background made me one of the few analysts in our firm who could actually understand the underlying blockchain technology beyond the hype. Derek's reaction to this opportunity was immediate and negative. He called cryptocurrency a scam and suggested that associating myself with it would damage my professional reputation. When I explained the legitimate applications and growth potential, he dismissed my analysis with a condescension I'd never heard from him before. "You're not thinking clearly," he said, still emotional from the miscarriage and not seeing how this could hurt your career. The implication that my professional judgment was compromised by grief was insulting enough that I should have recognized it as a red flag, but instead I found myself defending my emotional stability rather than my analytical assessment. We fought frequently during this period, always about my work and never about his. Derek's company was thriving thanks largely to the restructuring I'd designed, but he was working longer hours and traveling more often. When I complained about his absence, he reminded me that he was building our financial security, that someone had to focus on making money since I seemed more interested in intellectual exercises than practical career advancement. The accusation was absurd given that my salary at Cascade was substantial, but he delivered it with such certainty that I began questioning my own value. The final betrayal before everything collapsed began with a casual request. Derek asked me to look over some investment documents for a friend of his, Brandon Walsh, who was considering a major commercial property purchase. I spent an evening reviewing the materials and immediately identified serious problems with the financial projections and market analysis. The deal was structured to benefit the sellers enormously while exposing Brandon to significant downside risk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wrote up a detailed memo explaining why he should walk away from the investment and sent it to Derek to pass along. 2 weeks later, Derek came home excited about a new partnership opportunity. Brandon had brought him into a commercial development deal that was going to be incredibly lucrative, a mixed-use property in an emerging neighborhood with strong fundamentals and excellent financing terms. As he described the details, I realized with growing horror that it was the exact same deal I'd told him was a terrible investment. When I pointed this out, Derek explained that he'd had other experts review the materials and they disagreed with my assessment, that I'd been overly conservative because I didn't understand commercial real estate the way finance professionals did. I pulled up my original analysis on my laptop and walked him through every point of concern, showing him exactly why the deal was structured to fail. Derek listened with visible impatience, then told me I was being dramatic, that I couldn't handle him succeeding without my help, that my need to be the smartest person in every situation was becoming a problem in our marriage. The argument escalated until he finally admitted he'd never shown Brandon my analysis at all, that he'd known I would be negative about any deal he did independently and hadn't wanted to deal with my criticism. That night I slept in the guest room for the first time in our marriage. I lay awake until dawn, finally seeing the pattern I'd been refusing to acknowledge. Derek didn't value my expertise except when it served his purposes. He wanted a wife who was smart enough to be impressive at dinner parties but not ambitious enough to prioritize her own career over his needs. My mathematical mind had been useful for solving his problems but threatening when applied to my own advancement. Every choice I'd made to support him had been reframed as evidence of my proper priorities, while every choice I'd made for myself had been questioned as selfish or misguided. The property deal failed exactly as I'd predicted, 6 months later. Brandon Walsh lost nearly everything, and Derek's company took significant losses on their investment. He never acknowledged that I'd been right, never apologized for dismissing my analysis. Instead, he became increasingly critical of me, finding fault with how I managed our household, how I dressed, how I interacted with his business associates. The man who'd once seemed proud of my intelligence now treated it as a character flaw he had to manage. I started documenting everything. Every conversation where Derek dismissed my professional opinion, every instance where he took credit for work I'd done, every time he suggested I was being too sensitive or not thinking clearly. Claire helped me see what I'd been denying, that my marriage had become a slow erasure of my identity, that the partnership I'd believed in had always been one person supporting another person's dreams while abandoning her own. The dinner at the Sterling Room was supposed to be a celebration of Derek's company securing a major development contract. He'd invited several business associates including Gregory Chen, a commercial real estate investor who was considering partnering with Derek on future projects. Vanessa Porter was there with her husband, another developer in Derek's network. I'd met most of them before at various industry events, had even helped Derek prepare presentations for some of them, but I always attended these dinners as decoration rather than participant. I wore a navy dress that Derek had picked out, simple and elegant but unremarkable. He'd suggested I keep my jewelry minimal, that I didn't want to look like I was trying too hard. I'd learned over the years that trying too hard meant appearing too intelligent, too accomplished, too anything that might draw attention away from him. The role of supportive wife required making myself smaller, and I'd become expert at occupying just enough space to reflect well on him without casting any shadow of my own. The dinner conversation flowed around me as it always did at these events. Derek held court, describing the development project and his vision for transforming an underutilized industrial area into mixed-use spaces. I'd reviewed every financial model for the project, had actually identified the funding structure that made it viable, but I sat quietly eating my appetizer while he presented it as entirely his own strategic thinking. Gregory Chen asked intelligent questions about market analysis and risk mitigation, questions I could have answered in detail, but Derek fielded them with surface-level responses that sounded confident enough to satisfy people who didn't understand the underlying mathematics. Then Gregory turned to me with the polite interest people show when they remember someone else is present. "And what do you do, Victoria?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected me to say something about charity work or interior design. I opened my mouth to answer, to say I was a quantitative analyst at Cascade Financial Group, but Derek's hand found my knee under the table with that warning squeeze I'd learned to recognize. "She's just a housewife," Derek said with that dismissive laugh, the one that invited everyone to share his amusement at the very idea that I might have professional identity worth discussing. "She keeps everything running at home so I can focus on deals like this." The table offered polite chuckles and knowing nods, the kind of social lubrication that keeps dinner conversation flowing smoothly. Vanessa Porter smiled at me with something that might have been sympathy or condescension, saying that managing a household was such important work, as if she believed the obvious lie. Something crystallized in that moment, sitting with my dessert fork halfway to my mouth while strangers who'd never asked me a single substantive question laughed at my apparent lack of ambition. I'd spent 7 years making myself smaller for this man, turning down promotions and suppressing my expertise, and I'd been repaid by being introduced as just a housewife to people I'd helped become wealthier. The rage that flooded through me was cold and calculating, the same clarity I felt when solving complex financial problems, and I knew exactly what needed to happen next. My phone was already in my lap, the banking application open behind my napkin. Derek didn't know that when I'd helped restructure his company's finances 2 years earlier, I'd also ensured that I maintained access to the management accounts. He'd signed the authorization papers I'd prepared without reading them carefully, trusting that his wife wouldn't protect her own interests when helping him succeed. The accounts held just over $12 million, a combination of operating capital and escrow funds for ongoing projects. With 3 taps and my biometric confirmation, I initiated a freeze on every account, locking them completely pending investigation of ownership claims. Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket during dessert. He ignored it initially, too focused on impressing Gregory Chen with projections for their potential partnership. It buzzed again, then a 3rd time in rapid succession. He excused himself with mild annoyance, stepping away from the table to check what was apparently urgent enough to interrupt his performance. I watched his face change through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, confusion shifting to alarm then to something close to panic. He returned to the table trying to maintain composure but failing badly. "There's been some kind of banking error," he announced with forced casualness, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I need to handle this. We should probably call it an early night." Gregory Chen frowned, asking if everything was all right with the development project. Derek assured him it was just a technical glitch, nothing to worry about, but his voice had risen slightly and a muscle twitched in his jaw. I set down my dessert fork carefully and dabbed my mouth with my napkin. "It's not a banking error," I said clearly, my voice cutting through Derek's attempts at damage control. "I froze the accounts about 20 minutes ago. Every single one." The table went absolutely silent. Derek stared at me like I'd started speaking an unfamiliar language. Gregory Chen's eyebrows rose with interest rather than alarm. Vanessa Porter's mouth actually fell open slightly. Brandon Walsh, who'd lost money on that property deal Derek had ignored my warnings about, started laughing quietly to himself. "You can't do that," Derek said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Those are company accounts." "My company accounts." "Actually," I replied with the same calm tone I used when presenting market analysis to clients, "they're accounts that I restructured and that list me as an authorized manager with full control. You signed the papers giving me that authority 2 years ago when I saved your company from bankruptcy. Did you forget that part?" His face flushed dark red, anger, and embarrassment fighting for dominance. "This is insane, Victoria. You're having some kind of episode. We'll discuss this at home." "An episode," I repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what we're calling it when a wife exercises the legal authority her husband granted her?" "Because I'd call it enforcement of contractual rights." Gregory Chen leaned back in his chair, watching us with the focused attention of someone witnessing something unexpected and fascinating. Derek moved toward me like he might physically remove me from the restaurant, but I remained seated. "If you'd like your accounts unfrozen," I continued in the same measured tone, "you'll need to agree to my terms. We can discuss them with lawyers present, which I recommend since you'll want documentation. Until then, every dollar in those accounts stays exactly where it is, inaccessible to you or anyone else." The look on his face was worth every year of making myself smaller, every promotion I'd turned down, every time I'd let him take credit for my work. I stood up, gathering my clutch and pashmina with steady hands. "Gentlemen, Vanessa, thank you for a lovely evening." I glanced at Derek with something that wasn't quite pity but close. "You can take an Uber home. The car service is no longer available to you." Then I walked out of the Sterling room with my head high, leaving behind the wreckage of a marriage that had died long before I'd had the clarity to bury it properly. The elevator doors closed behind me before the trembling started. I made it to the parking garage and into my car before the full weight of what I'd just done crashed over me like a wave. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and for several long minutes I simply sat there in the dim concrete structure, listening to my own ragged breathing echo in the silence. I just detonated my entire life in front of witnesses, had publicly humiliated the man I'd married, and now I had to figure out what came next with nothing but burning bridges behind me. The drive back to our house in Cherry Hills felt surreal, like I was watching someone else navigate familiar streets while my mind raced through immediate practical concerns. Derek would be furious when he got home, possibly violent in ways he'd never been before. I'd seen his face when I'd announced what I'd done, watched something dangerous flicker behind his eyes before he'd tried to regain control. 7 years of marriage had taught me Derek's relationship with his self-image, how central his success narrative was to his identity. What I'd done hadn't just frozen his accounts, it had shattered his carefully constructed image in front of people whose opinions mattered to his business. I pulled into our driveway and sat staring at the house we'd bought together 3 years ago. The mortgage was in both our names, but I'd provided the down payment from my savings at Cascade. Derek had insisted on a property that projected success even though it stretched our budget, one of those 5-bedroom colonials with professional landscaping and a 3-car garage we didn't need. Looking at it now, I saw it for what it was, a stage set designed to convince people Derek was more successful than his actual balance sheet supported. Inside, I moved with methodical efficiency born from my analytical training. First priority was documentation and security. I went to Derek's home office and photographed every document I could find related to his business, our joint finances, and anything else that might become relevant in divorce proceedings. His filing system was chaotic compared to my organized approach, but I'd helped him enough over the years to know where he kept important papers. Bank statements, investment records, partnership agreements, tax returns, all of it went into my phone's encrypted storage through an app Claire had recommended months ago when I'd first started questioning my marriage. Next I packed essentials into 2 suitcases, moving through our bedroom with strange calmness. Clothing, toiletries, my laptop, important documents, the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. Everything else could be dealt with later through lawyers, but I needed to leave before Derek returned. The house suddenly felt threatening, like walls that might trap me if I stayed too long. I loaded my car and took one last walk through rooms that had never quite felt like home, recognizing now that I'd been a guest in Derek's vision of success rather than a partner building something together. My phone buzzed constantly with incoming calls from Derek's number. I ignored them all, watching the notifications pile up as I drove away from Cherry Hills toward downtown Denver. Claire had given me a standing offer to stay with her any time I needed, but showing up at her apartment at 11 on a Thursday night felt like admitting defeat in ways I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Instead I checked into the Crawford Hotel at Union Station, a boutique property where Derek and I had stayed once during our first year of marriage. The irony of seeking refuge in a place associated with better times wasn't lost on me, but I needed somewhere anonymous and comfortable while I figured out my next move. The hotel room was elegant in that carefully curated way that costs money to look effortless. I sat on the bed still wearing my navy dress and pulled out my phone to survey the damage I'd inflicted. My email already contained 3 messages from Derek's business attorney demanding I reverse the account freeze immediately. There was a voicemail from Brandon Walsh that I played on speaker, his voice surprisingly sympathetic as he said he understood why I'd done what I did and wished me well. Vanessa Porter had texted asking if I was safe and needed anything, which startled me since we'd never been particularly close. The message that made my breath catch was from Derek himself, sent an hour after I'd left the restaurant. The tone was completely different from his earlier calls, carefully calibrated to sound reasonable rather than angry. "Victoria, I know you're upset and we need to talk about what's bothering you. I didn't mean anything hurtful by what I said at dinner. You know how these business events are, people expect certain narratives. Come home and we'll work this out together like we always do." The manipulation was so obvious now that I had distance from it, the way he reframed his public dismissal of me as something I'd misunderstood, something we'd work out if I would just be reasonable and come home to discuss it. I deleted the message without responding and opened my banking apps to review my own financial situation. My salary from Cascade Financial Group was substantial, and I'd maintained my own accounts throughout the marriage despite Derek's occasional suggestions that we should consolidate everything. Looking at the numbers now, I realized I'd been unconsciously preparing for this moment, keeping my finances separate and accessible even as I'd surrendered other aspects of my independence. I had enough to sustain myself for months without touching joint assets, enough to hire excellent legal representation and start over if necessary. Sleep came in restless fragments punctuated by anxiety dreams where I was trapped in conference rooms explaining financial concepts to people who kept interrupting to ask when I was having children. I woke at 6 feeling exhausted but clear-headed, my analytical mind already working through the logistics of disentangling 7 years of merged lives. First, I needed legal counsel, someone who specialized in high-asset divorces and understood the complexity of frozen business accounts. Then I needed to inform my employer about the situation before Derek's attorney tried to cause problems at Cascade. Claire answered my call on the second ring despite the early hour. Her voice shifted from sleepy confusion to alert concern as I explained what had happened at dinner. There was a long pause after I finished, then she started laughing, a genuine full-throated sound of delight that made me smile despite everything. "You actually froze his accounts in the middle of dessert," she said with obvious admiration. "Victoria Hayes, you magnificent vindictive genius. I've been waiting years for you to remember you're smarter than that mediocre man." Her response shouldn't have surprised me since Claire had never hidden her opinion of Derek, but hearing her celebrate my nuclear option felt validating in ways I desperately needed. She insisted I come to her apartment immediately, that we'd have breakfast and start making plans while I was surrounded by someone who actually valued me. An hour later I was sitting at her kitchen counter eating scrambled eggs while she pulled up contact information for divorce attorneys she knew through her own work in corporate law. The attorney Claire recommended most strongly was Diane Russo, a woman with a reputation for aggressive representation of high-earning wives whose husbands had tried to minimize their contributions. Her office could see me that afternoon if I was available, which I was since I'd already sent an email to my manager at Cascade explaining I needed a few personal days to handle a family emergency. Claire came with me to the appointment, partly for moral support and partly because her legal background meant she could help me understand the strategic implications of different approaches. Diane Russo's office was in a sleek downtown building with mountain views that probably cost as much as most people's rent. She was in her 50s with steel gray hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that assessed me with the focused attention of someone trained to identify weakness and strength in equal measure. I spent 2 hours walking her through my marriage, Derek's business, my role in saving his company, and the events of the previous night. She took extensive notes and asked questions that revealed she understood financial manipulation as well as legal strategy. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair with a slight smile. "Your husband made several critical mistakes," she said with obvious satisfaction. "First, he underestimated your intelligence and your willingness to protect yourself. Second, he gave you legal authority over accounts without understanding the implications. Third, he publicly humiliated you in front of witnesses who can testify to his dismissive treatment. We can work with this." She outlined a strategy that would use the frozen accounts as leverage for a favorable settlement while documenting Derek's pattern of taking credit for my work and diminishing my professional identity. The meeting left me feeling simultaneously empowered and overwhelmed. Diane had made clear this would be an expensive and potentially protracted process, that Derek would fight aggressively to protect both his assets and his reputation. She'd also warned me that freezing the accounts, while emotionally satisfying, had created complications I'd need to address. Some of the money in those accounts belonged to investors and project partners, not just Derek personally. I'd need to work with a forensic accountant to separate legitimate business capital from assets that should be considered marital property or compensation for my uncredited contributions. Over the next 3 days I moved through the strange liminal space of a life in transition. I stayed at Claire's apartment since returning to the hotel felt too isolated, sleeping on her guest room bed surrounded by my hastily packed belongings. Derek's calls and messages continued with increasing desperation, alternating between apologies and threats, manipulation and rage. His attorney sent formal demands for me to unfreeze the accounts, threatening legal action if I didn't comply immediately. Diane responded with her own letters detailing Derek's history of professional misconduct and my legitimate claim to management authority over the business finances. The situation exploded into public awareness faster than I'd anticipated. Someone at that dinner, probably Brandon Walsh based on his reputation for gossip, had shared the story of what happened at the Sterling Room. Within a week it was circulating through Denver's business community as a cautionary tale about underestimating your spouse. Several people I barely knew reached out with messages of support or morbid curiosity. A reporter from a local business publication contacted me asking for an interview about women in finance whose contributions are systematically erased by male partners. My manager at Cascade called requesting a meeting to discuss my situation. I went to the office with considerable anxiety, uncertain whether the company would view my actions as admirable assertiveness or problematic drama that reflected poorly on their employee. Instead I found unexpected support from several colleagues who'd watched me help Derek over the years while receiving no recognition. My manager, a woman named Patricia Oakes who'd built her own career fighting similar battles, told me bluntly that she'd been disappointed when I'd turned down that promotion years ago and was glad to see me finally standing up for myself. The conversation shifted to my future at Cascade. Patricia asked directly whether I planned to stay with the company or if the situation with Derek would make remaining in Denver untenable. I admitted I hadn't thought that far ahead, that I'd been focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. She mentioned that Cascade had been discussing opening a satellite office in Austin, Texas, and wondered if I might be interested in leading that expansion. The role would be a significant promotion with equity compensation and considerable autonomy to build the team and focus areas I thought made most strategic sense. Austin represented everything Denver hadn't been, a city where nobody knew my history with Derek or had preconceptions about who I was supposed to be. The tech industry boom there meant growing demand for sophisticated financial analysis, and the cryptocurrency work I'd wanted to pursue years ago would fit naturally into that market. I told Patricia I was extremely interested and would like to discuss details once I had more clarity on my legal situation. She assured me the opportunity would remain available and that Cascade valued my contributions enough to work around whatever timeline I needed. The meeting with the forensic accountant Diane had hired took place in her office conference room, a full-day session reviewing every transaction in Derek's business accounts for the past 3 years. The accountant, a meticulous man named Kenneth Park, had already done preliminary analysis and wanted to walk me through his findings. What he revealed was worse than I'd suspected. Derek hadn't just taken credit for my work, he'd been systematically billing clients for financial consulting that I'd provided, pocketing fees for services I'd performed while telling me I was just helping my husband. Kenneth estimated that over 3 years, Derek had earned approximately $400,000 from work I'd actually done, none of which had been reported as marital income or shared with me. Additionally, several of the major deals Derek had closed were only viable because of financial restructuring I'd designed, meaning my intellectual property had created value in his company that should be compensated. The frozen $12 million included funds that were arguably at least partially mine based on uncredited contributions, though proving that in court would require extensive documentation and testimony. Armed with this information, Diane drafted a settlement proposal that was aggressive but justified by the evidence. She demanded not just standard asset division but compensation for my uncredited work, acknowledgement in writing of my contributions to Derek's company, and a structured payout that would function essentially as back wages for consulting services I provided without proper compensation. The proposal made clear we were prepared to litigate publicly if necessary, including testimony from clients and business associates about my actual role in deals Derek claimed as his own achievements. Derek's response came through his attorney with predictable outrage. He characterized my demands as extortion and accused me of trying to destroy his business out of spite. His counter-proposal offered minimal asset division and insisted I had no legitimate claim to compensation for what he termed voluntary spousal support that any reasonable wife would provide. Reading it, I felt the last remnants of sentiment for our marriage dissolve into cold anger. He still couldn't acknowledge what I'd contributed, still couldn't see me as anything more than an accessory to his success. The standoff continued for 2 weeks while Derek's business suffered from the frozen accounts. He'd managed to secure emergency financing from investors to cover immediate operational needs, but the situation had damaged his reputation and credibility. Several potential partners had pulled out of deals, unwilling to work with someone whose business practices were under scrutiny. Brandon Walsh publicly ended his partnership with Derek, citing concerns about financial management, which I suspected was his diplomatic way of saying he no longer trusted Derek's competence after watching me systematically dismantle his narrative. Claire kept me grounded through this period, reminding me to eat and sleep and occasionally step away from the legal documents that consumed my attention. She'd watch me work through financial models late into the night, calculating exactly how much value I'd created for Derek's company, and ask gently whether I was doing this for justice or revenge. Both, I'd answer honestly, because they weren't mutually exclusive. I wanted fair compensation, but I also wanted Derek to understand that dismissing me as just a housewife had been the most expensive mistake of his professional life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Gregory Chen, the investor who'd witnessed my announcement at dinner, contacted Diane's office requesting a meeting with me. He came to her office 3 days later with a proposal that reframed the entire situation. He'd been considering partnership with Derek before that dinner, but my demonstration of financial acumen followed by his research into my actual background had shifted his interest. He wanted to know if I'd be interested in consulting work for his investment portfolio, particularly analyzing commercial real estate deals for hidden risks that conventional analysis might miss. The offer was validation of a sort I hadn't realized I desperately needed. Here was someone who'd seen me dismissed as a housewife and responded by investigating my actual credentials, someone who valued my expertise enough to actively seek it out. I agreed to preliminary discussions, and over coffee at a neutral location I walked him through my analytical approach to market risk assessment. Gregory listened with the focused attention of someone actually interested in substance rather than performance, asking technical questions that demonstrated he understood the mathematics underlying my models. By the end of that meeting, Gregory had offered me a formal consulting contract with compensation that exceeded what Cascade paid me annually. The work would be project-based and flexible enough to accommodate my planned move to Austin, and he explicitly wanted my name on all reports and analysis I provided. No more invisible labor, no more having my insights presented as someone else's strategic thinking. He mentioned almost casually that several of his investor colleagues had heard about the dinner incident and were curious whether I'd be available for similar consulting work on their portfolios. The irony was perfect in ways that felt almost scripted. Derek's public dismissal of me had accidentally advertised my capabilities to exactly the network of people who could benefit from my expertise. His attempt to minimize me had backfired spectacularly, creating opportunities that wouldn't have existed if he'd simply introduced me accurately at that dinner. I signed Gregory's consulting contract the following week, and Diane immediately incorporated it into our settlement negotiations as evidence of my professional market value and the income Derek's behavior had prevented me from pursuing. Faced with mounting pressure from multiple directions, Derek finally agreed to serious settlement negotiations. The mediation took place in Diane's office over 2 grueling days, with both sides presenting evidence and arguments while a neutral mediator tried to find acceptable middle ground. Derek looked diminished somehow, his usual confidence replaced by defensive anger as he was forced to sit through testimony about deals I'd saved and analysis I'd provided. His attorney tried repeatedly to characterize my work as normal spousal support, but Kenneth's forensic accounting made clear the scope and sophistication of services I'd provided went far beyond typical marital assistance. The final settlement gave me everything I'd asked for and more than I'd expected. Substantial asset division including my full down payment returned with interest, compensation for 3 years of uncredited consulting work, and a structured payout from Derek's company that would continue for 5 years as acknowledgement of value I'd created through financial restructuring. Additionally, Derek was required to send letters to specific clients and business associates acknowledging my contributions to deals he'd claimed credit for, a public correction of the narrative he'd constructed about his own competence. The victory felt hollow in some ways, because no amount of money could return the years I'd spent making myself smaller or compensate for the promotion I'd turned down. But it also felt necessary, a drawing of boundaries that should have existed from the beginning of our marriage. Diane assured me the settlement was exceptional, that most women in similar situations received far less because they lacked the documentation and professional credibility I'd maintained despite Derek's efforts to erase my identity. I signed the papers in Diane's office on a Tuesday afternoon with Claire beside me as witness. Derek signed separately at his attorney's office, unwilling to face me even for the formal end of our marriage. The divorce wouldn't be final for months due to Colorado's waiting periods, but the financial settlement was immediately binding. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in years, unencumbered by the weight of pretending to be less than I was. That evening Claire took me to dinner at a restaurant we'd loved in graduate school, a hole-in-the-wall Thai place that had survived Denver's gentrification through sheer quality. Over pad Thai and spring rolls, she asked what I planned to do with my new freedom and settlement money. The question hung in the air while I considered possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Austin was waiting with the Cascade position and consulting work from Gregory's network. I had financial security and professional validation. Most importantly, I had proof that I could build a life based on my actual capabilities rather than someone else's assessment of my worth. I'm going to be exactly who I should have been all along, I told Claire with certainty that came from clarity rather than bravado. Someone who doesn't apologize for being competent, who doesn't shrink to make other people comfortable, who builds partnerships instead of accepting subordination. She raised her glass in a toast to new beginnings and lessons learned the hard way, and we drank to the death of who I'd been and the birth of who I was becoming. The moving truck pulled away from Claire's apartment on a humid Saturday morning in late September, taking the last of my belongings toward Austin while I stood on the sidewalk feeling equal parts excitement and terror. 3 months had passed since that dinner at the Sterling Room, 3 months of legal battles and financial restructuring and slowly rebuilding a sense of self that didn't revolve around managing Derek's ego. Now I was driving toward a city I'd only visited twice, where I knew exactly 2 people and had nothing but possibility stretching out before me like an empty canvas. The drive from Denver to Austin took 2 days because I refused to rush through what felt like a symbolic journey between versions of myself. I stopped for the night in Amarillo, eating dinner alone at a diner while reviewing the employment contract Cascade had finalized the week before. The title was Director of Quantitative Analysis for the Southwest region, a position that gave me authority to build my own team and pursue the cryptocurrency and blockchain analysis I'd been interested in years ago. The salary was 40% higher than what I'd been making in Denver, with equity compensation that would vest over 4 years and performance bonuses tied to client acquisition and portfolio growth. Gregory Chen's consulting contract sat in my briefcase alongside the Cascade paperwork, a backup plan that was actually more lucrative than my primary employment. He'd connected me with 3 other commercial real estate investors who wanted my analysis on potential acquisitions, and word was spreading through networks I'd never had access to before. The irony still amazed me, that Derek's public dismissal had functioned as unintentional advertising for capabilities I'd been hiding for years. Every consulting inquiry that came through felt like vindication, proof that my expertise had value independent of any relationship or marriage. Austin welcomed me with the kind of oppressive heat that makes you question relocation decisions, the thermometer reading 103 degrees as I navigated unfamiliar highways toward the Zilker district apartment I'd rented sight unseen. The neighborhood was nothing like Cherry Hills with its manicured lawns and architectural uniformity. Here vintage bungalows sat next to modern condos, food trucks parked on corners alongside established restaurants, and the general atmosphere suggested creativity valued over conformity. My apartment was in a renovated warehouse building with exposed brick and industrial fixtures, the kind of space Derek would have dismissed as trying too hard to be cool. Unpacking took 3 days because I kept stopping to explore my new surroundings or sit on my balcony watching unfamiliar street life flow past. The solitude should have felt lonely after 7 years of marriage, but instead it felt spacious, like I'd been living in a too-small room and finally had space to stretch properly. Nobody here knew me as Derek's wife or that woman who froze her husband's accounts. I could introduce myself as Victoria Hayes, quantitative analyst and financial consultant, without any qualifying explanations about my relationship status or domestic arrangements. The Cascade office in Austin was temporary space in a shared workspace downtown while the company finalized lease negotiations for permanent headquarters. My first day involved meeting the small existing team, 3 analysts who'd been working remotely and were excited about having dedicated leadership and resources. They were younger than me by 5 to 7 years, smart and hungry in ways that reminded me of my own early career before I'd started compromising ambition for relationship stability. We spent the first week just talking through their current projects and frustrations, identifying where they needed support and what opportunities they saw in the Austin market. Building a team from nothing was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I had budget authority to hire 4 additional analysts and freedom to define our focus areas within Cascade's broader mandate of quantitative financial analysis. The cryptocurrency and blockchain work I'd wanted to pursue in Denver fit perfectly with Austin's tech ecosystem, and several of my new team members had exactly the mathematical and programming backgrounds needed to develop sophisticated analytical models. We started sketching out a research program that would position Cascade as leaders in crypto market analysis, identifying patterns and risks that traditional financial institutions were missing. The work consumed me in healthy ways, filling days with problems that had solutions rather than emotional tangles that defied resolution. I'd arrive at the office by 7 and often stayed until 8 or 9, not because anyone expected it but because I was genuinely engaged with what we were building. My team responded to leadership that trusted their intelligence and encouraged experimentation, and within a month we developed preliminary models that caught the attention of Cascade's executive team in Chicago. Patricia Oakes called personally to say she'd received multiple inquiries from potential clients about our crypto analysis capabilities, word spreading through networks faster than traditional marketing could have achieved. The consulting work with Gregory's network provided different challenges and satisfaction. These were high-stakes commercial real estate deals where my analysis could save or cost investors millions, where the complexity of financial structuring required understanding not just mathematics but human psychology and market dynamics. I'd spend evenings reviewing property acquisition documents, building models that tested assumptions about rent growth and occupancy rates and market appreciation, identifying risks that sellers were hiding or buyers weren't seeing. Every report I delivered carried my name and credentials prominently, explicit acknowledgement that this analysis came from my expertise rather than being channeled through someone else's reputation. One of Gregory's colleagues, an investor named Marcus Thornton, became a regular client whose projects were particularly interesting. He specialized in adaptive reuse developments, converting obsolete commercial properties into mixed-use spaces that served changing community needs. His approach required sophisticated financial modeling because traditional comparables didn't exist for many of his projects. We'd spend hours on video calls discussing not just numbers but vision, how to quantify the value of community benefit alongside investor returns, how to structure deals that aligned incentives across multiple stakeholder groups. Marcus was in his early 40s, originally from Houston but based in Austin for the past decade. He had the casual competence of someone who'd proven himself enough times that he didn't need to perform expertise, asking genuine questions when he didn't understand my analytical approaches and offering insights from his own experience when he saw gaps in my assumptions. Our working relationship felt collaborative in ways I'd never experienced with Derek, mutual respect between professionals who valued what each other brought rather than competition over whose contribution mattered more. 3 months into my Austin life, Marcus invited me to tour one of his projects, a former textile factory he was converting into a combination of affordable artist studios, small business incubators, and market-rate residential lofts. The property was in East Austin, an area experiencing rapid gentrification that Marcus was trying to navigate thoughtfully by including affordable components that would maintain economic diversity. He wanted my analysis on whether the financial structure he designed could actually deliver promised returns while maintaining the affordable elements, or if he was being overly optimistic about market conditions. I spent a Saturday walking through the massive building with Marcus and his development team, taking measurements and photos while he explained his vision for how different spaces would function. The artist studios would rent below market rate to provide accessible workspace, cross-subsidized by market-rate residential units on upper floors. The business incubators would offer flexible terms for local entrepreneurs, with mentorship programs funded by a percentage of successful business revenues. The entire concept required believing that community benefit could coexist with investor returns, that development didn't have to be extractive to be profitable. My analysis took 2 weeks because I wanted to test multiple scenarios and market conditions, identifying which assumptions were critical versus which had flexibility. The final report ran 40 pages with detailed financial projections, risk assessments, and recommendations for structural adjustments that would improve both returns and community impact. I delivered it to Marcus over coffee at a cafe near the project site, watching him read through the executive's summary with focused attention that reminded me why I enjoyed this work. "Your numbers are more conservative than mine," he said finally, "but your logic is sound. If I adjust the residential unit mix the way you're suggesting and restructure the debt instruments, this actually works better than my original plan." He looked up from the report with genuine appreciation. This is exactly the kind of analysis I needed. Someone who understands both the financial mechanics and the social objectives. Most consultants I work with can do one or the other but not both. The compliment settled warm in my chest, validation from someone who had no reason to flatter me or inflate my contributions. We spent the next hour discussing implementation details and potential complications, the kind of substantive professional conversation I'd been starving for during my marriage without fully recognizing the deprivation. When Marcus asked if I'd be interested in ongoing consulting work as the project progressed, I agreed immediately, excited by both the intellectual challenge and the opportunity to contribute to development that actually served community needs. Life in Austin was developing rhythms that felt sustainable in ways Denver never had. Morning runs along the Lady Bird Lake Trail before work, afternoons building financial models with my Cascade team, evenings either consulting on real estate projects or exploring the city's music scene that justified its live music capital reputation. I discovered a Vietnamese restaurant near my apartment that reminded me of places Claire and I had frequented in graduate school, became a regular at a coffee shop where the barista learned my order, found a yoga studio that helped work out the physical tension that accumulated from hours at a computer. The solitude that had felt spacious initially began occasionally feeling lonely as months passed, particularly on weekends when my work didn't provide structure. I'd find myself wandering farmers' markets or neighborhood festivals alone, watching couples and friend groups with something that wasn't quite envy but adjacent to it. Claire visited once and commented that I seemed lighter somehow, less weighted by expectations I couldn't name, but she also worried I was replacing emotional avoidance from my marriage with work avoidance of processing what had happened. The divorce finalized in December on a gray Tuesday that felt appropriately somber for the official end of a 7-year mistake. Diane handled the final paperwork remotely so I didn't have to return to Denver, and the only marker of the occasion was a notification on my phone that the case had been closed. I sat in my Austin apartment staring at that notification, trying to feel something significant about no longer being legally married to Derek Lansing, but mostly I just felt tired and ready to move forward with building whatever came next. My team at Cascade had grown to 8 analysts by year-end, and our cryptocurrency research program was attracting serious attention from institutional investors who'd previously dismissed crypto as speculative nonsense. We developed predictive models for Bitcoin and Ethereum price movements that significantly outperformed traditional technical analysis, using machine learning algorithms I'd designed that identified patterns invisible to conventional approaches. When Cascade's CEO flew to Austin specifically to meet with our team and discuss expansion plans, I felt pride in what we'd built from nothing in less than 6 months. The consulting work with Marcus's projects had evolved into something resembling friendship, professional boundaries blurring as we discovered shared interests beyond real estate development and financial modeling. He'd invite me to community meetings related to his projects where I'd meet local business owners and artists and activists working to shape Austin's growth in intentional ways. Through these connections I began to see how financial analysis could serve broader purposes than just maximizing investor returns, how sophisticated modeling could actually help communities resist displacement or negotiate better terms with developers. One evening in January, Marcus invited me to dinner at a restaurant he'd helped finance as part of a commercial development project, a farm-to-table concept that sourced from local producers and employed people with barriers to traditional employment. The invitation felt different from our usual working meals, more personal in ways that made me simultaneously nervous and intrigued. I deliberately avoided dating since leaving Derek, focused entirely on professional rebuilding and not ready to risk vulnerability with anyone new. The restaurant was warm and intimate with an open kitchen where you could watch chefs work, exactly the kind of place Derek would have dismissed as lacking sophistication. Marcus was already seated when I arrived, and his smile when he saw me carried warmth that definitely exceeded professional courtesy. We ordered without looking at menus, trusting the chef's recommendations, and settled into conversation that started with his latest project but quickly moved into more personal territory. He asked about my divorce in ways that felt genuinely curious rather than prying, listening as I explained the broad strokes without dwelling on painful details. When I mentioned Derek's dismissal of me at that dinner, Marcus shook his head with visible frustration. "I've worked with so many men like that," he said quietly, "people who mistake their partner's support for weakness and can't recognize talent that doesn't serve their ego. The fact that you not only left but systematically dismantled his financial structure is poetic justice." I found myself telling him things I'd barely discussed with Claire, about the years of making myself smaller and turning down opportunities, about the promotion I'd refused and the career trajectory I'd abandoned for a marriage that had never valued my sacrifices. Marcus listened without judgment or unsolicited advice, and when I finally stopped talking he simply said that my ex-husband was an idiot who'd lost something irreplaceable because he'd been too insecure to recognize its value. The evening shifted after that confession, walls I'd maintained for self-protection lowering slightly in response to his obvious respect and interest. We talked about his own history, a marriage that had ended 5 years ago when his ex-wife had relocated for her career and they'd realized their relationship wasn't strong enough to survive distance. He spoke about her with fond respect rather than bitterness, explaining they'd simply wanted different things and been mature enough to acknowledge incompatibility before resentment poisoned everything. When Marcus asked if I'd be interested in attending a gala fundraiser for an affordable housing nonprofit he supported, I recognized the invitation for what it was, a date rather than a professional obligation. My immediate instinct was to deflect, to maintain the safe boundaries between consulting work and personal connection, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he looked at me like I was interesting rather than decorative, or how our conversations challenged my thinking rather than requiring me to simplify my intelligence. Maybe I was just tired of protecting myself from possibilities because one man had proven unworthy of trust. I said yes to the gala and spent the following week second-guessing the decision, alternating between excitement and anxiety about whether I was ready for this. Claire called it progress when I mentioned it during one of our regular phone conversations, pointing out that Marcus sounded nothing like Derek and that eventually I'd need to risk trusting someone again if I wanted partnership rather than permanent solitude. She was right, of course, but knowing something intellectually and feeling ready emotionally occupied different territories. The gala was at a renovated warehouse space in East Austin, the nonprofit's own adaptive reuse project that served as both headquarters and demonstration of their mission. Marcus picked me up at my apartment wearing a suit that somehow managed to look both formal and relaxed, and complimented my dress without the assessing quality I'd learned to expect from Derek's evaluations of my appearance. The drive to the venue was easy conversation about the nonprofit's work and the political challenges of affordable housing in rapidly gentrifying cities. Inside, the event hummed with the particular energy of people who care deeply about their cause mixing with donors who have capacity to fund it. Marcus introduced me to board members and major supporters, always including my professional credentials and never reducing me to relationship status or decorative accompaniment. When someone asked what I did, he'd say Victoria is the quantitative analyst who's helping me structure my development deals to actually serve community needs, before stepping back to let me explain my work in my own terms. The difference from that dinner at the Sterling Room couldn't have been more stark. Here I was treated as a professional with valuable expertise, engaged in substantive conversations about how financial modeling could advance social equity, asked thoughtful questions about my analytical approaches. Marcus stood beside me not as someone who needed to control the narrative but as genuine partner proud to be associated with my capabilities. When he introduced me to the nonprofit's executive director and she immediately asked if I'd be willing to consult on their financing structures, I felt seen in ways I'd forgotten were possible. We stayed late after most guests had left, helping the catering staff clean up because Marcus had worked as a server during college and couldn't stand watching other people work while he socialized. Carrying tables and stacking chairs informal where probably wasn't how most gala dates ended, but it felt authentic in ways that expensive restaurant performances never had. When Marcus drove me home and walked me to my apartment door, the goodnight kiss that happened felt natural and unhurried, promise of something developing rather than performance of expected romance. Over the following months, Marcus and I built something that defied easy categorization. We were professional colleagues on his development projects, genuine friends exploring Austin's food and music scenes, and increasingly romantic partners learning each other's histories and hopes. He never pressured me to define the relationship or move faster than I felt ready, comfortable with ambiguity in ways that suggested emotional maturity I hadn't encountered before. When I had anxiety about whether I was repeating patterns from my marriage, he'd listen patiently and point out concrete differences in how we operated, how we shared power and valued each other's autonomy. My work at Cascade continued expanding beyond my initial expectations. The cryptocurrency research program had attracted enough client interest that the company approved hiring a dedicated team of 6 additional analysts focusing exclusively on blockchain technology and digital asset markets. I was promoted to Vice President of Emerging Markets Analysis with compensation that included significant equity in Cascade's parent company. At 35, I'd achieved the professional recognition I'd abandoned years ago for a marriage that never valued what I sacrificed. The consulting work grew parallel to my Cascade responsibilities, enough that I had to start declining projects or referring them to other analysts I trusted. Gregory Chen's network had expanded to include institutional investors and family offices managing hundreds of millions in assets, all wanting sophisticated analysis of commercial real estate opportunities. Marcus's projects alone provided steady income and intellectual challenges that kept me engaged even when Cascade work felt routine. Life had balance I'd never managed during my marriage, professional achievement coexisting with personal relationships and individual identity. I maintained regular contact with Claire, who visited quarterly and constantly reminded me how different I seemed from the diminished person I'd been in Denver. My sister Diane had reconnected after years of distance, apologizing for not recognizing how unhealthy my marriage was and celebrating my rebuilt career. Even Patricia Oakes at Cascade mentioned during performance reviews that my leadership had transformed since leaving Denver, confidence replacing the apologetic uncertainty I'd developed while constantly managing Derek's ego. A year after moving to Austin, I organized a celebration dinner for my Cascade team to mark our research program's first anniversary and multiple successful client deliveries. We reserved a private room at the Vietnamese restaurant I'd adopted as my regular spot, and I invited Marcus since the team knew we were together and had uniformly approved. Watching my analysts laugh and swap stories about challenging projects while Marcus charmed them with development disaster anecdotes, I felt profound gratitude for how completely my life had transformed. One of my younger team members, a brilliant programmer named Simone Davis who specialized in machine learning applications, pulled me aside during dessert. "I just want to thank you for building this team the way you have," she said with obvious sincerity. "I've worked places where women had to constantly prove themselves or downplay their expertise. Here you just expect us to be competent and give us space to do excellent work. It means more than you probably realize." Her words carried me back to that kitchen conversation I'd overheard 7 years ago, my mother telling Derek that my sister Elizabeth was the real achiever while I was merely the dreamer who'd never amount to much. Standing in this restaurant surrounded by a team I'd built and a partner who valued my capabilities, I finally understood that their assessment had been a reflection of their limitations rather than truth about my potential. I'd let their narrative shape my choices for too long, internalizing criticism that said more about their insecurities than my actual worth. That night Marcus and I walked along the lake trail under a sky full of stars impossible to see in Denver's light pollution. He asked what I was thinking about and I tried to explain this sense of having finally become the person I was supposed to be all along, no longer constrained by others' expectations or diminished by their need to feel superior. Marcus listened, then said something that crystallized everything I'd been processing. "You didn't become someone different," he observed gently. "You just stopped pretending to be smaller than you are. That's not transformation, that's liberation." The invitation arrived on a Wednesday morning in late March, 2 years after I'd walked out of the Sterling Room and 18 months into my Austin life. It was embossed cream cardstock with formal calligraphy announcing the Mountain West Real Estate Development Summit in Denver, a 3-day conference bringing together investors, developers, and financial analysts from across the region. Cascade Financial Group was listed as a platinum sponsor, and my name appeared in the program as a featured speaker on a panel about quantitative risk assessment in commercial property markets. I stared at that invitation for a long time, coffee growing cold in my hand while I processed the implications of returning to Denver for a high-profile industry event. The conference would draw exactly the kind of people who'd witnessed my marriage's public implosion, who'd heard stories about the housewife who froze her husband's accounts over dessert. Derek would almost certainly attend since his company operated in this space, assuming he'd rebuilt enough credibility after our divorce and the business disruptions that followed. The prospect of facing him professionally after 2 years apart triggered anxiety I thought I'd moved beyond. Marcus found me still holding the invitation an hour later when he stopped by my apartment before his morning run. He read it over my shoulder and asked the obvious question about whether I planned to accept. I explained my hesitation about returning to Denver and potentially encountering Derek in professional settings where we'd both be performing competence for industry audiences. Marcus settled onto the couch beside me and pointed out that refusing the invitation meant letting fear of awkward encounters limit my career opportunities, that I'd worked too hard rebuilding my professional reputation to avoid showcasing it because my ex-husband might be in the room. He was right, of course, and the rational part of my brain knew I should accept this speaking opportunity that would position me as a thought leader in front of hundreds of industry professionals. The emotional part still flinched at the idea of Derek watching me present analysis he'd once dismissed as overly academic and impractical. We'd had no contact since the divorce finalized, our interactions mediated entirely through attorneys until the settlement was complete. I had no idea whether he'd rebuilt his business or if his reputation remained damaged from the revelations about taking credit for my work. I accepted the invitation that afternoon and spent the next 2 weeks preparing presentation materials that would demonstrate the sophistication of analytical approaches I'd developed at Cascade. The panel topic was risk assessment in uncertain markets, and my contribution would focus on using machine learning algorithms to identify patterns in property valuations that traditional analysis missed. It was technical work that required genuine mathematical expertise, exactly the kind of presentation that would either establish credibility or expose you as someone performing knowledge you didn't actually possess. My Cascade team helped me refine the presentation, challenging assumptions and suggesting clarifications that would make complex concepts accessible without oversimplifying. Simone built interactive visualizations that would let me demonstrate our predictive models in real time, showing how our algorithms had anticipated market corrections that caught conventional analysts by surprise. By the time I boarded my flight to Denver, I felt confident about the content even if I remained nervous about the context. Claire insisted on picking me up from the airport despite my protests that I could manage a rental car. She appeared at baggage claim wearing a huge smile and immediately pulled me into a hug that communicated how much she'd missed having me in the same city. The drive from the airport to my hotel wound through familiar Denver streets that triggered unexpected nostalgia. 2 years felt simultaneously like forever and no time at all, distance that should have been enough to neutralize emotional associations but somehow wasn't. The hotel Cascade had booked was downtown near the convention center, a modern property that prioritized function over character. I checked in and found Claire had arranged flowers in my room with a note reminding me I was brilliant and capable and had nothing to prove to anyone who'd underestimated me. The gesture made me tear up in ways that surprised me, evidence I was more anxious about this return than I'd been admitting to myself. I unpacked formal business attire I'd purchased specifically for this conference, wanting to project authority and expertise through every visual detail. The conference opened Thursday morning with a keynote address from a prominent real estate economist discussing demographic shifts and their implications for property markets. I sat near the back scanning the audience for familiar faces, spotting several people I'd known during my years at Cascade's Denver office. A few caught my eye and smiled with what looked like genuine warmth, while others quickly looked away suggesting they felt uncomfortable about history they'd witnessed or heard about. I didn't see Derek anywhere in the main ballroom, which provided temporary relief even as it guaranteed the eventual encounter would catch me unprepared. My panel was scheduled for Friday afternoon, which meant I had a full day to attend other sessions and network before my own presentation. I'd planned to spend Thursday strategically, attending panels relevant to my work and making connections that could benefit Cascade's growth. Instead, I found myself distracted by hypervigilance about Derek's presence, scanning every room I entered and unable to fully focus on content being presented. The anxiety was frustrating because it revealed how much power I'd given him over my emotional state despite 2 years of deliberate distance and rebuilding. Lunch on Thursday was a networking event in the hotel's grand ballroom with assigned seating designed to force conversation between strangers. I found my table and discovered I'd been placed with a mix of developers and financial analysts, none of whom I recognized. The woman to my left introduced herself as Helen Winters, a financial consultant specializing in distressed property acquisitions. She was probably in her 60s with silver hair cut short and eyes that assessed me with sharp intelligence before she extended her hand. We fell into easy conversation about market conditions and analytical approaches, and I found myself genuinely engaged rather than performing networking obligations. Helen had worked in commercial real estate finance for 40 years and had stories about market cycles and spectacular deals gone wrong that illustrated principles my models were trying to capture mathematically. When she asked about my background, I gave the condensed professional version that elided the personal drama, focusing on my quantitative analysis work in the cryptocurrency research program I'd built at Cascade's Austin office. Helen listened with the focused attention of someone actually interested rather than waiting for her turn to talk. After I finished, she leaned back slightly and said something that caught me off guard. "You're Victoria Hayes," she stated rather than asked. "The woman who took down her husband's company after he introduced her as just a housewife at dinner." I heard about that from 3 different sources and honestly it's legendary. My stomach dropped as I realized my professional reputation would forever be entangled with that story, that I couldn't attend industry events without people knowing me primarily through my marriage's spectacular failure. Helen must have seen my expression change because she immediately clarified her meaning. "Don't misunderstand me," she said firmly. "That story made you famous in certain circles for exactly the right reasons. You demonstrated something a lot of women in this industry experience but never effectively address, that their expertise gets systematically erased by men taking credit for their work. What you did took courage and frankly more financial sophistication than most people possess. I've been telling young women in this field about you as an example of protecting your value." Her perspective reframed the narrative in ways I hadn't considered, positioning my actions as professional self-defense rather than personal vindictiveness. We talked for another hour about patterns she'd observed in her 4 decades of work, how talented women's contributions were routinely minimized or appropriated, how the industry's culture rewarded aggressive self-promotion while penalizing women who advocated for themselves too forcefully. Helen had clearly thought deeply about these dynamics and had strategies for navigating them that I wished I'd learned earlier in my career. When lunch concluded, Helen handed me her card and suggested we stay in touch. She mentioned she was considering retirement in the next few years and was looking for younger analysts with both technical skills and ethical grounding to whom she could refer her established clients. The offer was generous and unexpected, exactly the kind of professional connection that could significantly expand my consulting practice. We agreed to have coffee before the conference ended, and I walked away from that lunch feeling less isolated in my experience and more validated in my choices. The afternoon sessions provided useful technical content about changing lending standards and emerging property markets, but I remained distracted by anticipation of my panel the following day. That evening I had dinner with Claire at our favorite Thai restaurant from graduate school days, and she insisted I stop obsessing about the presentation and Derek's potential presence. "You're prepared, you're brilliant, and you're going to be the most credible person on that stage," she said with absolute certainty. "And if Derek shows up he'll have to sit there watching you demonstrate exactly what he lost when he underestimated you." Friday morning I woke early with presentation anxiety churning in my stomach. I went for a run along familiar Denver trails trying to burn off nervous energy, then spent 2 hours reviewing my materials one final time. The panel was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon in one of the convention center's larger meeting rooms, with seating for approximately 300 attendees. When I arrived 30 minutes early to test the presentation technology, I found the room already half full with people settling in for what the conference program had flagged as a featured session. The other panelists were established names in commercial real estate finance, 2 men in their 50s who'd built successful analysis firms and a woman probably 10 years older than me who ran the risk assessment division for a major institutional investor. We made small talk backstage while audio technicians adjusted microphones, and I felt reasonably confident I belonged in their company based on the work I'd done at Cascade. The moderator ran through logistics and timing, then it was time to walk onto the stage facing an audience that had grown to standing room only. I scanned the crowd during introductions and felt my heart constrict when I spotted Derek sitting 4 rows back slightly left of center. He was watching the stage with studied casualness that suggested he'd been very deliberately monitoring who noticed his presence. Brandon Walsh sat beside him looking uncomfortable, which made sense given Brandon had publicly ended their partnership after my divorce revelations. The rest of Derek's row contained people I didn't recognize, probably current business associates he'd assembled as some kind of professional support system or witnesses to whatever he thought was about to happen. The moderator introduced each panelist with brief biographical summaries, and when she reached me I heard a few whispers ripple through the audience that suggested people were making connections between my name and the story Helen had referenced. The introduction highlighted my role-building Cascade's cryptocurrency analysis program and my consulting work with commercial real estate investors, framing me as an expert in emerging analytical methodologies. I forced myself to focus on the moderator rather than Derek's presence, reminding myself I was here to discuss substantive work regardless of who sat in the audience. The panel format involved each person presenting 10 minutes on their analytical approach, followed by moderated discussion and audience questions. I was scheduled third, which meant I had to sit through 2 other presentations while my anxiety built. The first panelist discussed traditional comparable sales analysis with slight modifications for market volatility, competent but unoriginal work that wouldn't challenge anyone's thinking. The second focused on incorporating environmental risk factors into property valuations, more interesting but still within conventional frameworks that most sophisticated investors already understood. Then it was my turn to present, and I stood to walk to the podium feeling hyper-aware of Derek's eyes tracking my movement. I pulled up my first slide showing a graph of commercial property price predictions from various analytical models overlaid with actual market performance. The traditional approaches showed poor predictive accuracy during periods of rapid market change, while the machine learning algorithm I developed demonstrated significantly better performance. I walked the audience through the mathematical principles underlying the algorithm without dumbing down the complexity, explaining how it identified pattern correlations that human analysts typically missed. The technical content was dense enough that I could watch comprehension dawn unevenly across the audience. People with strong quantitative backgrounds leaned forward with interest, asking themselves questions I could anticipate about methodology and validation. Others looked slightly overwhelmed but tried to follow along, while a few seemed lost but unwilling to admit it publicly. Derek's expression was carefully neutral, giving me no indication whether he understood what I was presenting or just performing attentiveness. I moved into my second major point about how cryptocurrency markets and traditional real estate markets showed unexpected correlations that could be exploited for risk assessment. This was cutting-edge analysis that Cascade was developing proprietary advantage around, and I could sense the audience's energy shift as they recognized they were hearing something genuinely novel. The visualizations Simone had built demonstrated these correlations dynamically, showing how Bitcoin price movements preceded certain commercial property market shifts by predictable intervals. My final section addressed limitations and areas where human judgment remained essential despite algorithmic sophistication. I explained how our approach worked best when combining computational pattern recognition with experienced analysts who understood market psychology and could contextualize what the algorithms identified. This wasn't about replacing human expertise but augmenting it with tools that processed information at scales impossible for individuals. The point seemed obvious to me but clearly resonated with an audience worried that technological advancement meant their skills becoming obsolete. I finished with 3 minutes remaining in my allocated time and returned to my seat while the final panelist presented on stress testing property portfolios under various economic scenarios. His content was solid but felt conventional after what I just shared, and I noticed several audience members still looking at my slides displayed on the side screens rather than focusing on the current speaker. When the moderator opened discussion questions, the first 3 were directed at me, asking for clarification about specific aspects of my algorithmic approach and whether my models were available for licensing. The questions demonstrated genuine interest rather than skepticism, and I answered as specifically as I could without revealing proprietary details that represented Cascade's competitive advantage. Other panelists contributed their perspectives, and we developed interesting dialogue about how different analytical approaches could be integrated rather than viewing them as competing methodologies. The moderator had to cut off discussion after 45 minutes when we'd overrun our scheduled time, and several audience members approached the stage afterward wanting to continue conversations privately. Derek didn't approach the stage but I watched him exit the meeting room with Brandon and his associates, his expression unreadable from that distance. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant that he'd witnessed me presenting sophisticated analysis he'd once dismissed as impractical, but mostly I just felt exhausted from maintaining composure while performing under his observation. Helen Winters appeared in the cluster of people waiting to talk with me, and her proud smile communicated approval that somehow mattered more than whatever Derek thought. The remainder of the afternoon dissolved into back-to-back conversations with investors and analysts wanting to know more about Cascade's work or explore potential consulting relationships. I collected business cards and scheduled follow-up calls, watching my professional network expand in real time based purely on demonstrated expertise rather than relationships or reputation. By the time I escaped the convention center, my face hurt from smiling and my voice was hoarse from extended conversation, but I felt validated in ways that reached deeper than any single relationship's approval or disapproval. Claire insisted on taking me to dinner at an upscale restaurant in Cherry Hills that had opened after I'd left Denver, somewhere with no associations to my marriage or previous life. Over wine and excellent pasta, she made me replay the panel presentation in detail, celebrating moments where I'd clearly impressed the audience and laughing at my description of Derek's carefully neutral expression. "You know he was dying inside," she said with satisfaction. "Watching you be brilliant at exactly the work he told you wasn't practical, demonstrating expertise to hundreds of people while he sat there unable to dismiss it. That's better than any revenge you could have planned." She was probably right, though revenge had never been my primary motivation. What I'd wanted was validation that my capabilities had value independent of Derek's assessment, proof that the years I'd spent compromising my ambitions had been wasted on someone whose judgment was fundamentally flawed. The panel had provided that validation publicly and professionally, in front of exactly the community whose opinion mattered for my career. Derek's presence had been incidental to that achievement, even if his observation had added emotional weight to the performance. Saturday morning I met Helen for coffee at a spot near my hotel, and we spent 2 hours discussing her client portfolio and analytical approaches she'd developed over decades of practice. She offered insights about navigating commercial real estate finance as a woman that I wish I'd learned 20 years earlier, strategies for establishing credibility and protecting your contributions from appropriation. Her willingness to mentor me felt like a gift, expertise shared generously rather than hoarded competitively. Before we parted, Helen mentioned she'd spoken with several of her longtime clients about my panel presentation and my consulting work. 3 of them wanted introductions to discuss potential engagements, institutional investors managing hundreds of millions who needed sophisticated risk assessment for their commercial property portfolios. She'd already forwarded my contact information with her strong recommendation, which in her network carried weight that years of self-promotion couldn't match. I thanked her with genuine emotion, recognizing this as the kind of professional breakthrough that could transform my consulting practice. The conference concluded with a Saturday afternoon reception in the hotel's rooftop space, a networking event with panoramic mountain views and an open bar that encouraged people to lower their professional guards slightly. I attended reluctantly, already exhausted from 2 days of intense social performance, but Claire convinced me I should make one final appearance to capitalize on the visibility my panel presentation had generated. We arrived fashionably late to find the reception in full swing, conversations flowing as freely as the alcohol. I'd been there perhaps 20 minutes, talking with a developer about his challenges modeling risk for mixed-use properties, when Derek approached with Brandon trailing slightly behind, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. My developer conversation partner excused himself with suddenly remembered urgency, leaving me facing my ex-husband for the first time since our divorce had finalized 18 months ago. He looked older somehow, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before and something diminished about his posture that suggested the past 2 years hadn't been kind. "Victoria," he said with forced casualness, his voice carrying none of the confidence I remembered. "That was an impressive presentation yesterday. I didn't realize you'd developed such sophisticated analytical capabilities." The backhanded compliment implied I'd somehow acquired these skills recently rather than possessing them throughout our marriage, but I refused to take the bait. "I've been doing this kind of work for 15 years, I replied evenly. "You just never paid attention to what I was actually capable of." Derek flinched slightly at my directness, and Brandon looked increasingly uncomfortable witnessing this exchange. There was a long pause where Derek seemed to be weighing his words carefully, perhaps recognizing that the power dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, though his tone suggested the words didn't come easily. "For how I treated you during our marriage. For not recognizing what you contributed to my success. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, and I realize now that I was threatened by your intelligence instead of appreciating it." The apology landed hollow despite what might have been genuine intent behind it. 2 years ago I would have desperately wanted to hear those words, would have felt vindicated by his admission that he'd been wrong about me. Now they just felt irrelevant, acknowledgement that came too late to matter for anything except his own conscience. I appreciate you saying that, I replied carefully, but it doesn't change anything. What matters is that I finally stopped waiting for your validation and built a career based on my actual capabilities. He nodded slowly, absorbing the implicit rejection of his attempt at reconciliation. His business had apparently survived our divorce but never fully recovered, Brandon interjected quietly. Several major clients left after the settlement details became public, and investors got nervous about his judgment. He's been rebuilding, but it's been difficult. The information was offered as explanation rather than excuse, and I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and something almost like pity watching Derek stand there diminished by consequences of his own choices. Marcus appeared at my elbow with impeccable timing, introducing himself to Derek with professional courtesy that nevertheless communicated protective positioning. Derek's eyes widened slightly as he recognized Marcus's name from his reputation in Austin development circles, and I watched him make rapid calculations about what my relationship with Marcus might mean. This is my partner, I said deliberately, using the ambiguous term that could mean business or romantic relationship. We work together on several commercial development projects that integrate sophisticated financial modeling with community benefit objectives. The conversation continued for a few more awkward minutes before Derek excused himself, Brandon following with visible relief. Marcus waited until they were out of earshot before asking if I was all right. I realized with some surprise that I actually was, that seeing Derek had been uncomfortable but not devastating, that his apology had meant far less than I once thought it would. The power he'd held over my sense of self-worth had evaporated completely, replaced by confidence built through my own achievements rather than anyone else's assessment. Claire found us shortly after and insisted on taking a photo of Marcus and me with Denver's mountains visible behind us through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wanted documentation of this moment, she said, evidence of how far I'd come from the woman who'd fled this city 2 years ago with nothing but determination and hurt feelings. Looking at that photo later, I barely recognized myself in the confident woman standing beside Marcus, shoulders back and genuine smile suggesting comfort in my own skin I'd never managed during my marriage. The flight back to Austin Sunday afternoon felt like closing a chapter rather than escaping. Denver was no longer a city of painful memories but simply a place where I'd once lived, where I'd made mistakes and learned difficult lessons that ultimately led to better outcomes. I'd proven to myself and anyone who cared that my capabilities had value independent of Derek's opinion, that the housewife he dismissed so casually possessed expertise he'd never fully understood or appreciated. More importantly, I'd built a life in Austin that reflected my actual priorities and values rather than someone else's vision of who I should be. Marcus met me at the Austin airport with takeout from my favorite Vietnamese restaurant, and we drove to my apartment where I could finally drop the professional performance I'd maintained for 3 days. Over spring rolls and pho, I told him about Helen's mentorship offer and the consulting opportunities her referrals would create, about Derek's hollow apology and my surprising indifference to it, about feeling genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished rather than still carrying resentment about what had been taken from me. He listened the way he always did, with full attention and occasional questions that demonstrated he was tracking both content and emotional subtext. When I finished talking, he pointed out something I'd been circling around without quite articulating. "You've stopped defining yourself in opposition to your marriage," he observed. "You're not the woman who left Derek anymore, you're just Victoria building the career and life you want. That shift is everything." He was right, and his observation crystallized months of gradual transformation I'd been too close to recognize clearly. I'd spent the first year after leaving Denver proving I could succeed without Derek, measuring my progress against the narrative he'd constructed about my limitations. Somewhere in the second year that had shifted, my ambitions becoming about what I wanted to build rather than what I needed to prove. The conference had been a final test demonstrating I could operate in Derek's proximity without being defined by our history, that my professional identity stood completely independent of that relationship. Monday morning I returned to Cascade's Austin office energized rather than depleted by the conference experience. My team wanted to hear about the panel presentation, and I walked them through the audience response and follow-up conversations that had resulted. Several of the consulting opportunities Helen had referred would require expanding our analytical capabilities, and we spent the morning brainstorming how to structure our research program to accommodate this growth. The work was challenging and engaging, exactly what I'd been seeking when I'd made that desperate drive to Austin 2 years ago with no plan beyond survival and reinvention. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.